If you recall, a peak in dopamine is followed by a trough in dopamine. That trough in dopamine is experienced as pain or wanting or craving. That pain that I'm referring to is actually a craving or a wanting, and it's a craving or wanting for a specific state that you would like to achieve that is different than the one that you're in. You want to get out of that trough. And as you recall from earlier in the episode, that trough is the stimulus for the ongoing release of dopamine that provides the propeller, the motivation to go forward and seek some goal. Okay? So when we are not motivated, when we are in a so-called amotivated state, or when we are procrastinating, or when we just sort of can't seem to get in gear, the key to getting out of that pain trough is one of two things. I already told you earlier, you can just wait. You can wait till your motivation comes back. And a lot of people do wait. In fact, they procrastinate. They start doing other things that are less painful than the state that they happen to be in when they are, trying to get into gear to go work out, because I realize not everyone wants to do that, or to study, or to have a hard conversations, whatever it is. And what do? They start engaging in activities that we, and indeed they, would not consider pleasurable activities. They start, for instance, cleaning the house. So seemingly out of nowhere, they start engaging in these activities that normally are not intrinsically pleasurable for them. They're not highly motivated to do them, as a replacement for doing the very thing that they quote unquote need to do or ought to do, and that they're procrastinating to do. What they're essentially doing here is a mild type of addiction replacement. In other words, rather than be in the painful state and wait for it to pass, they're doing things that give them some sense of accomplishment, ostensibly to give them the sense that they're completing things. And perhaps, and I don't know because I'm not in the psychology of knowing what other people are thinking, perhaps in order to generate the momentum, in order to get engaged enough or motivated enough to study or work out or whatever activity it is that they're trying to avoid through procrastination. Now, what's interesting about this dynamic is, first of all, it's extremely common. And second of all, a lot of people will use this as a tactic so that they get very close to the deadline to complete something, and then they go into a sort of pseudo panic and then use anxiety as a way to leverage their mental and physical resources to complete that thing. How do I know the contour of this so well? How do I understand the inner dynamics of it? Well, part of that relates to my work as a neurobiologist and reading the papers that I'll mention to you in a moment. But it also relates to the fact that I'm somebody who waits quite a while right up until the sort of last minute possible to complete something for activities that I don't want to do. Something I've been working on my whole life. In any case, I'm very familiar with the procrastination process. So how can we overcome procrastination? Well, it turns out that there are findings from within the addiction literature that turn out to be very powerful towards leveraging our way out of procrastination. And it has to do with this. You already know, because I've told you probably a dozen times now, that the depth of the trough after a dopamine peak is proportional to how high that peak was and how steep it was, how quickly that peak occurred. It turns out that not only is the depth of the trough proportional to that, but the rate at which you get out of that trough is proportional to how steep that trough is. Let me explain this for you in as clear terms as I possibly can. Imagine you're in an amotivated state. You're just not feeling motivated. You're procrastinating. You may think, okay, the thing to do here is something. I'll clean the house. I'll take care of some bills. I'll do something. Or I'll just wait. Those approaches, as we talked about before, generally don't work, or at least don't work quickly, or they lead you right up to the deadline, and that's the deadline that forces you to get something done, or you just don't get it done and you don't succeed in your goal. That happens a lot as well. However, if you were to take that state of being unmotivated, of procrastinating, and actually do something that's harder than being in that amotivated state, in other words, doing something that's more effortful, even painful, you can rebound yourself out of that dopamine trough much more quickly. So what do I mean? You want to put yourself in a state that's worse than or harder than the state that you're in, or do something quote unquote more painful. And here I want to be very clear. I'll say this 3 times, but I'm going to say it for the first time now. When I say more painful, I do not mean doing any kind of tissue damaging or psychologically damaging behavior or anything of that sort that's going to render you injured or not well, even in the short term. That's not what I'm referring to. Okay, let's just get that one out of the way. What I'm referring to is the fact that, for instance, if you're feeling amotivated, but you find yourself cleaning the house as a way to procrastinate, you could say, well, cleaning the house is harder than sitting down and doing nothing. But actually, in that moment or in those moments, that's not the case, or else you wouldn't be doing it. The reality is that the dopamine system works according to what feels hard or easy in the moment. In other words, if you're feeling amotivated, you need to do something and put yourself into a state that's harder than the state you're in. So for instance, if you're sitting around feeling amotivated, or you find yourself tending to tasks that are irrelevant to the goal that you really should be focused on, you need to put your body and mind into a state of discomfort quickly. And the way to do that is to either engage in some tangential activity, meaning an activity not related to your goal that puts your body into a very different state. So here again, I'll default to the obvious one, which is something like cold shower or cold immersion, which not only increases dopamine long-term, or over several hours rather, but for most people is experienced as pain. That pain causes a rebound out of that dopamine trough faster than it would occur if you had just stayed in that amotivated state and waited for it to go away, or done something like cleaning up that for whatever reason felt like it required less friction. When I say friction, I mean limbic friction. Your limbic system is always in this dialogue with your forebrain. And limbic friction goes two ways. Limbic friction can be you're tired and you don't want to do something, and so you have to, quote unquote, motivate to do it, energize yourself to do it. Or limbic friction can be that you're nervous and scared and anxious to do something, and you have to calm yourself in order to lean forward into action in order to do that thing despite the anxiety.